Hello and welcome to the viewers of this video. This is the Orange Fan here, bringing you another entry for the episode Recap and Thoughts category. This video will be dedicated to the A segment of episode 3 of Codename Kids Next Door, Operation No-POWUH. We begin this segment with a group of villains known as the Parent-Teacher Organization for Eradicating Youngsters attacking the Sector V treehouse of the Kids Next Door. Thanks to their 2x4 technology, the Sector V operatives are easily able to force the group of villains to retreat. After a quick celebration, Number 1 questions Number 2 about why he decided to make a rubber band food fleener rather than take advantage of the treehouse's advanced power source. Number 1 also takes this chance to show his teammates the central power core of the treehouse, which is a room that contains a large number of hamster wheels, and a large number of hamsters are on these wheels, and they're just running on these wheels. So the hamsters running on these wheels is what's powering the treehouse. And Number 1 goes as far as to declare this method of this power source method as the most advanced power source in the world. Suddenly, the hamsters stop running on the wheels and they just leave the treehouse. And Number 1 is confused by this. Number 3 reveals that she decided to let the hamsters have a vacation because of how hard they work. But without the hamsters running on their wheels, the power in the treehouse goes out. So the next scene takes us to the mansion of the delightful children from down the lane. And we see that the delightful children are interviewing villains to take on the kids next door. The latest villain that they're interviewing is the Toilinator, and they decide to... they reject the Toilinator. Although they word it politely, they push a button which causes a spring-loaded floorboard to send the Toilinator flying. The next villain is Gramma Stuffum, and she believes that the delightful children are too skinny so they need to eat. So she creates sentient food for them to eat, but the delightful children try to politely decline by claiming that they've already eaten, but Gramma Stuffum is still not convinced. So the delightful children change tactics by saying if they eat all of Gramma Stuffum's food, there won't be enough for the kids next door, who they try to portray as starving and famished. And this catches Gramma Stuffum's attention. The delightful children then point Gramma Stuffum to the Sector V treehouse, although to be fair, it's an easy site to spot. But Gramma Stuffum tells her top minions, Liver and Onions, that it's time for them to prepare a large feast. Back at the treehouse, we see Number 2, Number 3, Number 4, and Number 5 are making the most of the lack of power in the treehouse by... they're playing around with their flashlights or telling ghost stories with their flashlights. Although they also question what do hamsters do on vacation. And we do get a quick scene showing us that all of the hamsters have gone off to the beach to have some fun. Number 1, though, is panicking about the lack of power in the treehouse, saying that the lack of power means they can't use their 2x4 technology, which means they're defenseless if any other villains come to invade the treehouse. Number 5 questions what's the worst that can possibly happen. Cue Gramma Stuffum arriving, and Number 1 giving them a look and pointing, and he essentially says, that could happen. So Gramma Stuffum prepares her sentient food, and yes, the sentient food prepare to force feed themselves onto the Sector V operatives. And the Sector V operatives are at a real disadvantage without their 2x4 technology. They even forget that they don't have access to their 2x4 technology anymore, because we see a few scenes of them trying to use it, only for them to remember that there's no power in the treehouse right now. Number 2 is actually the one Sector V operative who doesn't seem to be. Number 2 is the one Sector V operative who actually is holding his own against the sentient food army. And he actually doesn't seem to mind Gramma Stuffum's cooking as much as his teammates. There is a point where number 2 gets sent into the basement during the battle, but he eventually returns with eating utensils and condiments to help him battle the sentient food. Because this happens around the time when his teammates are too full to continue battling. But even number 2 eventually gets to the point where he's too full to continue the battle. So Gramma Stuffum instructs Liver and Onions to send in the dessert army. But then they all realize that the dessert army has been eaten by the hamsters. They've returned from their vacation, and the hamsters end up finishing off the rest of the sentient food army that's present. During the, I guess you could call it, the battle now with the hamsters turning the tide of the battle. During the battle, Gramma Stuffum, Liver, and Onions get knocked over, and they land on number 2's rubber band food fleener. So number 2 takes the chance to activate the rubber band food fleener to send Gramma Stuffum, Liver, and Onions flying. We do see that Gramma Stuffum, Liver, and Onions end up back at the Delightful Children's mansion, and Gramma Stuffum decides it's now time for the Delightful Children to eat. And although the Delightful Children try to insist that they've already eaten, the segment ends with Gramma Stuffum preparing her sentient food army for the Delightful Children. So this segment actually introduces 2 villains that we do go on to see in later appearances in later seasons of the series, Gramma Stuffum and the Toilinator. Now, Gramma Stuffum, I would say there's one more segment where Gramma Stuffum has a central role like she does in this segment. That won't be until season 4, if I'm not mistaken. But otherwise, she still does appear in villain group segments or appearances. But as far as segments where she's the main villain of the segment, there's one other segment besides this one. And the other villain that goes on to appear a lot in the series is the Toilinator. And this is actually funny because Tom Warburton revealed on one of his blog posts that the Toilinator was originally meant to just be a one-off joke villain who would only appear in this segment. Now, for some reason, he did end up changing his mind by the end of season 1, because given the way how production goes, the season 1 segments and episodes would have been finished before they aired on TV, or because of how close together these appearances for the Toilinator were, fan reaction wouldn't have had an impact just yet. But they did end up bringing Toilinator back for one more segment towards the end of season 1. And then afterwards, though, Toilinator ended up becoming a really popular villain. And so Toilinator ended up going on to appear throughout the rest of the series. He ended up having a few significant appearances in seasons 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And and Tom Warburton admit that he never would have thought that back when he was back during the production for season 1, he never would have anticipated that Toilinator would go on to become one of the frequent appearing villains in the series. Although Toilinator does end up becoming the joke villain of the series. And so we'll get to see more of Toilinator in the future. But for now, this was just his brief appearance. which, funny enough, ended up leading to a bigger appearance for him in the future. Otherwise, we do get a group of villains called the Parent-Teacher Organization for Eradicating Youngsters. And yeah, like, they may have a few cameo appearances, or they might get mentioned here or there, but they don't really have as significant... Yeah, they don't have many significant appearances later on when compared to Gramma Stuffum or the Toilinator. So they're kind of one of those other, very minor villains, I guess you could say. The other big thing about this segment, though, is we get to see the power source for the treehouse and, hamsters. And, yeah, a lot of hamsters running on hamster wheels is what powers the treehouse. And I do have to admit, that is actually a pretty effective, power source or method of power source. Although, the Sector V operatives were at a real disadvantage when the hamsters went on vacation because of all of their technology being plugged into the treehouse, and no power in the treehouse put them at a real disadvantage. And there are other shows or movies out there that would have that storyline about how a lack of power means that the usual technology that the characters would have access to isn't available for one because of a power out. Like, that's happened before in other stories before. That's kind of something that you can expect in other stories. But the thing about this one is, I think it was actually a good idea that they had this story as early in the show's run as they did. This was, like I said, this is the A segment for episode 3, and I think that was a good call to have it happen this early, because in later segments, I believe there's a segment in season 2 where they mention there's a backup generator or an alternate power source for nighttime when the hamsters are asleep. I believe that segment's in season 2. We'll cross that bridge when we eventually get to it. And some of the technology that's shown in this segment is shown to function without needing to be plugged in. So the point I'm trying to get across here is that having this plot line of the kids next door not being able to use their 2x4 technology due to a lack of power, it was a good idea to have it happen this early in the series run, because when they're shown not to have this problem later on in the series. So you can say that that the kids next door, or the Sector V operatives in particular, learned from this experience, and they made modifications to ensure that this wouldn't happen again. And it doesn't happen again. So that was actually a pretty good call. And once again, you could make the argument that this is an early example of the series' serialized nature, because they don't really fall into this conflict again. So, like I said before, I don't really mind seeing like a story told, like a similar story being told in different series. I pretty much accept that. It's to be expected for certain stories to have broad stroke similarities between different shows or movies or what have you, and that it's really more about the execution rather than how many times it's been done. That's always been how I viewed it. But what I'm getting at is, I do think that it was a good idea that they had this storyline early on in the show's run, because you have an explanation for why they don't run into this problem anymore, because they learned their lesson and they took precautions to make sure it didn't happen again. So that was actually a great idea, and that's why I really liked this segment in particular. And I guess similar to how Operation Ice Cream could be seen as a number 3 spotlight segment, and how Operation Cannon could be seen as a number 4 spotlight appearance, one could make the argument that number 2 was the spotlight character for this segment, because he was the one operative who was able to, he was the operative who did the best against Gramma Stuffum's sentient food army, and he was the one who ended up saving the day when well, actually the hamsters, I guess you could say they worked together. The hamsters finished off the rest of the sentient food army, while number 2 was able to get Gramma Stuffum liver and onions out of the treehouse with the rubber band food fleener, which was the very device that number 1 was dismissive of at the beginning of the segment. So yeah, I guess you could argue number 2 was the spotlight character for this segment, and I could see the argument for that. I think that holds water to it. And yeah, otherwise, I think that's about it for this particular segment. Like I said, we got to see several villains introduced in this segment. A group of them just being like very minor villains in the grand scheme of things, while 2 other villains do go on to have other appearances throughout the course of the series in a more significant way. And we also get an explanation for the Kids Next Door's power source. And like I said, they actually had a good way of handling a storyline where it didn't become a problem later on, because you could say they learned their lesson from it. And otherwise, just on a side note, I guess, one other little detail is I feel this is the segment where the Delightful Children's voices sound the way they do for the rest of the series, because in Operation Caked and both segments of segments of episode 2, I noticed the Delightful Children's voices sounding different compared to they do for the rest of the series. I think this is the segment where the voice artists settle into the role of the Delightful Children. So that's a little side note. Otherwise, I believe that's it for now. So as of this video, we've now discussed the A segment of episode 3 of Codename Kids Next Door on this channel. Take care, and until next time.